Hi everyone, this video is an explanation of the literary criticism essay assignment. We're looking right now at the section that I've added to Blackboard over here on the left sidebar, Literary Criticism Guidelines and Resources. So there you'll see the assignment sheet itself, which is what we're going to start with. So notice that this essay is longer than the poem explanation. It's about twice as long, so 1,000 to 1,250 words. And this essay also requires at least 2 sources in addition to the poem that you're analyzing itself. So as far as which poem you want to analyze for this assignment, you can choose that the same way you chose your poem for the explication assignment. You can choose a poem from the textbook, the Norton Anthology of Poetry, as long as it's not the same poem that you wrote about for the explication essay, and as long as it's not a poem that we've already discussed on the discussion forums. Or you can choose a poem from one of those 4 poetry collections that are listed on the first page of the syllabus. And then for your analysis of this poem, the reason this essay is twice as long as the explication essay is that you're going to analyze this poem using 2 different literary theories or schools of literary criticism. So the first approach is called a formalist approach, and this is basically what we've been doing all along throughout the semester. A formalist approach just looks at the text itself or the poem itself, identifies the various poetic devices that are used within the poem, explains the effects of those various poetic devices, and basically just ignores any outside context for that poem. So in a formalist approach, you're really just focusing on the poem itself. You're not thinking about what the author's autobiography is or what the historical time period is when the poem was written or anything like that. And then the second approach that you're going to use is a new historical approach. And this approach definitely does take into consideration the time period in which the poem is written. And this is why this essay should include at least 2 additional sources that help to provide that context for the historical period when your poem was written. So that context may be about what was happening in the culture during the time the poem was written, if there were, various political movements happening or wars, or it could be comparing that poem that you've chosen to other sort of popular cultural artifacts from the time, such as other poems or songs or books or movies. So you need to explain how those outside sources that you're including, or how that context from the time period the poem that you are analyzing that you're including help you, to understand what the poem means. So as with the first essay, you definitely need to be sure to include in-text citations throughout your essay, not only from the poem this time, but also from those outside sources. And remember that to avoid plagiarism, you provide in-text citations not only when you're directly quoting something, but if you're paraphrasing or summarizing information from one of those sources in your own words, you still need the in-text citation to show where that information is coming from, right? And remember also, you can review MLA format for in-text citations, but basically the in-text citation always corresponds to the first item in the works cited entry for that source. So if it's a source that lists an author's name, you would use that author's last name as your in-text citation for that source. In MLA style, if there's a source that does not list an author, then the first thing in the works cited entry for that source would be the title of the article. So you would use the title of the article for the in-text citation. And then, as always, you'll see the grading rubric for this assignment. This essay is worth 20% of your grade instead of 10% as the explication was, since it is twice as long. The rubric is going to look pretty similar, with the addition of, your analysis discussing the relevant cultural and historical context of the poem, so you're adding that new historical analysis to the formalist analysis that discusses the various poetic elements that are used within the poem and what their effects are. For your thesis statement for this assignment, you would want to summarize what your main sort of finding or takeaway is from that formalist approach and from that new historical approach, and then you'll unpack both of those findings throughout your essay. So, if we go back then to the Literary Criticism Guidelines and Resources page, in addition to the essay assignment that we just looked at, you'll see a link here to the Purdue OWL's page on formalist literary criticism. There's just a sentence quoted from it here. If you want to look at more detail about that approach, you can. Again, this is the approach that we've been using all along. So I think it's pretty straightforward. And then there's also a link to the Purdue OWL's page on new historical criticism, which again is pretty straightforward. I think it's just looking at the historical context that the poem was written in. The next thing that's on this page is some suggestions for how to organize this essay. Since you are going to be analyzing your poem using these two different methods, that really gives you three different options for how to organize this essay. You might analyze it using the formalist approach and then analyze it using the new historical approach. That's option one. Option two would be to sort of go through the poem chronologically from beginning to end, divide it up into sections, and analyze each section using both approaches. So you'd be kind of switching back and forth, right? Like here are the first few lines of the poem analyzed using a formalist approach. Here are the first few lines analyzed using a new historical approach. Here's the next section of the poem analyzed using formalism and new historicism, and so on. And then option three would be, think of that formalist approach where you're looking at the poetic devices and what their effects are as your sort of framework. And after you identify a specific poetic device, such as the use of line breaks or the rhyme scheme, then you would also expand on that by adding a new historical perspective. So which option you choose is up to you. They're all valid options for organizing your essay. It may also depend on the nature of the poem that you're choosing and what you want to talk about in your essay. I've also included an example here of a scholarly article analyzing the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. So this is a poem that is in your anthology, and the abstract of this article, which is basically the summary of the article, says that the poem carries the characteristics of modernist poetry. So this is sort of the new historical aspect of this analysis, is it's looking at modernist poetry, which was a particular poetic movement that was happening during the time that T.S. Eliot wrote this poem, and this poem is actually considered sort of one of the, primary poems that represent modernist poetry. So it's giving us that historical context of the poem within modernist poetry. That's a new historical approach. And then it's saying that the poem has these characteristics of modernist poetry, such as objective correlative, fragmentation, free verse, and irregular rhyming. So you can see how this list is really a list of different poetic devices that are being used within the poem itself. So that aspect of the analysis is really more of a formalist analysis. So it's a combination of the two types of analysis, right? It's saying here's how these various poetic devices that are highlighted reveal that this is an example of modernist poetry, of this historical movement that was happening at the time. So the two different approaches are really quite intertwined. So you've got that example to look at, and then as with last time, I do have a folder with two sample student essays. So the first essay is about a poem called The Leash by Ada Limon. This is from one of the poetry collections that students analyzed in a previous section of this course. So the poem itself is reproduced here at the beginning. and then you have the essay itself, and you can see this essay chooses to begin with the formalist interpretation, goes through and discusses various poetic devices, such as the rhythm and the vocabulary that is used and the imagery and what that represents, various symbols within the poem and how they could be interpreted. And then it transitions to analyzing the poem from that new historical perspective. So this essay chose to organize itself by first analyzing the poem with the formalist approach, and then analyzing it using that new historical approach. And then the second example student essay is analyzing a poem called Concord Hymn by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and this is a poem that is in your anthology, so you can read it there. And this poem also does the formalist analysis followed by the new historical analysis. So in the formalist analysis, you see it starts out talking about the rhyme scheme, the word choice, and what those effects are of those various poetic elements, additional poetic devices such as alliteration. This is all still the formalist analysis. Here it talks about caesura, which is another poetic device that we've talked about this semester. It mentions synecdoche as a tactic that is used as well, and then it also switches to, actually that mention of synecdoche is the second mention of synecdoche in this essay, because at this point the essay has actually already mostly transitioned to a new historical approach, although it does mention that poetic device a second time in the essay, where I highlighted it below. So you can look at both of those examples to help you understand what I'm looking for in this assignment. The other resource that you might want to look at as you're doing research is this link on the left sidebar, Tri-C Library English Literature Resources. Now, if we look at the sample student essays, their resources are not really scholarly resources, right? These are just articles that these students found online to provide some historical context. And that's totally fine. The other essay looked at the poem itself, and then again, just historical information they found online about what this poem was referencing. If we look at the scholarly article analyzing the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, because it's a scholarly article, because its new historical analysis is tying this poem to a poetic movement, it's referring to other scholarly sources. So you're not required to use scholarly sources for this assignment. If you just want to use things that you found online by Googling them to provide historical context, that's fine. If you do want to take the more scholarly approach, then these English literature resources from the Tri-C Library might be useful, particularly the literature article databases here in this first column. If you wanted to click on one of those, particularly the MLA International Bibliography, and if you typed in the search box that pops up the title of the poem that you're analyzing, then you might find some more information about that. If you do that, just be careful that you're not sort of co-opting that scholarly analysis as your own, right? I still want to see your own original thoughts about this. So again, it's okay if you're not using these more scholarly resources for this essay. I will be requiring the use of more scholarly resources for the final essay of the semester. So just kind of a heads up that that information is out there for you. And as always, let me know if you have any questions.